Snow fell in wide, slow flakes, each one seeming to drift with its own secret purpose, gathering against the stone platform of the small frontier station. The rails sang faintly as the cold bit into their steel, the whistle of a distant train already fading into silence. Smoke from the chimney of the depot hung low and gray, clinging to the air as though reluctant to move on. It was a morning wrapped in quiet judgment, where even the sky seemed to lean close and listen to the whispers of men. He stood alone near the far end of the platform, a giant of a man, shoulders broad beneath a weathered buffalo hide coat. His hair, once the dark shade of storm clouds, had turned white as the snow around him, falling long against the lines of a face carved by years of wind and sorrow. His name, spoken rarely now, was Dakota. To most who cast a glance his way, he was only the old Apache, a relic left behind by time and tribe alike. Townsfolk passed by without pausing, some with narrowed eyes, others with lips curled faintly in scorn. Once, they had feared men like him. Once, the sight of his height, the thunder of his stride, would have been enough to hush a room. But years bend even the strongest tree. The same mouths that once cursed his people now dismissed him with a crueler word. Useless. Too old for war, too strange for peace. Dakota felt it in their eyes, the weight of rejection, heavier than any snowdrift. He carried it like a second coat, threadbare, unshakable, cold against the skin. He had come here not searching for kindness, but for something more fragile, a reason to remain upright in a world that had turned its back. And yet the station offered no welcome, only the hard benches of the waiting room, the shuffle of boots, the hiss of gossip that slipped between scarf-wrapped mouths. "Look at him!" someone muttered near the doorway, words carried on the frosted air. White hair, still wandering like a ghost. Dakota did not answer. His silence had become his defense, the shield he raised when stones were not of rock but of tongue. Still, he stood straighter, refusing to crouch beneath their judgment. Snow gathered on his shoulders, and he let it. It was honest in its touch, unprejudiced in its falling. The door to the station groaned open, spilling warmth and light across the planks. A young woman stepped out, her cloak pulled close, her cheeks flushed by travel and the sting of wind. She was not like the others, though they, too, turned to watch her. Her beauty carried a softness that did not ask to be seen, yet could not be ignored. Brown hair escaping her bonnet, eyes the clear hue of river water before it freezes. She was 25, though hardship had carved shadows at the edges of her grace, and her name was Chenoa. She paused, drawing in the scene with quiet thoughtfulness. The snow, the murmurs, the solitary figure at the platform's end. Something within her stilled, as if the sight of him was the answer to a question she had carried in secret all her life. She walked past the townsfolk who whispered, their voices clinging to her like burrs. She walked past the station's door with its glow of firelight and promise of safety. Her steps crunched against the snow until she stood before Dakota, who towered above her, though weariness weighed on his stance. His gaze shifted down, expecting her eyes to mirror the same judgment he had endured from so many. But her look held none of it. Instead, there was a trembling reverence, a certainty that seemed to root her to the earth. She studied his face, the lines of hardship, the streaks of white in his hair, the depth in his dark eyes. To her, he was not discarded. He was weathered stone, enduring where others had crumbled. "You stand alone," she said softly, her voice nearly lost in the wind. He said nothing, but his eyes flickered, betraying the faintest spark of surprise that she had spoken at all. Chenoa hesitated only a moment, then stepped closer, her breath a fragile cloud between them. "I know what they say," she whispered. "That you are too old, too forgotten. But they do not see what I see." Her words were a warmth that cut through the cold. Dakota felt them settle in the hollow places left by years of silence. He wanted to look away, to deny the gift of her gaze, but he could not. All around, the town lingered in its quiet judgment, waiting to laugh, to sneer, to remind them of the rules unspoken yet rigid as stone. A young woman had no place at the side of a man, weathered by 45 winters. A settler had no place seeking solace in the arms of an Apache outcast. But Chenoa did not care for their eyes. She leaned closer, her lips trembling not from cold, but from the weight of words long carried. snowflakes caught in her lashes, melting as she breathed them out. I have waited my whole life for you. The sentence fell with the same gravity as the snow, silent, inevitable, and undeniable. It landed in the quiet space between them, shifting something that had seemed immovable. Takoda's chest tightened, not with pride but with the ache of disbelief. He searched her face, looking for jest, for pity, for any trace of cruelty disguised as tenderness. But all he found was truth, simple, unwavering truth. Behind them, the murmurs grew sharper, the judgment heavier, like stones hurled into the stillness. Yet for the first time in many years, Takoda felt the weight lift rather than press down. The cold air stung his lungs, but there was fire now, faint but alive, flickering in the hollow of his chest. Chenoa's hand rose, hesitant, then steady, brushing snow from his coat as though it mattered, as though he were worth the touch. The gesture was small, but it rang louder than any declaration. The station clock struck once, its echo cutting through the whispers. The world seemed to pause. Takoda's hand twitched at his side, aching to reach for hers, yet restrained by the fear that had kept him silent for decades. Snow swirled between them, a curtain of white against the dark shapes of the watching town. The moment stretched, fragile, unsteady, yet brimming with the promise of change. And then, in the quiet that followed, Takoda's lips parted. Not for words yet, but for breath, for the beginning of something he had thought forever denied him. The station doors closed behind them, but the sound of whispers carried even through the glass, like the echo of a wind that refused to die down. Chenoa's words still lingered in the air, fragile yet unshakable. I have waited my whole life for you. Takoda stood rooted where she had left them, snow melting on his shoulders, the hush of her vow colliding with the cruel chorus of the town. By the time they reached the main street, the gossip had grown teeth. Voices slipped out of saloon doors, curled from the lips of women at the mercantile, drifted from men standing idle near wagons. Too old for her. What's she thinking? A white-haired savage. The phrases clung to Takoda more sharply than the snow against his skin. He felt them burn where once spears had struck and arrows had grazed. This wound was quieter, but it cut deeper. Chenoa walked beside him with her chin lifted, though her hands trembled inside her cloak. She heard it all, yet she did not falter. Abby, her young cousin, skipped at her side, a slip of a girl with wide eyes that drank in everything. When a group of boys shouted cruelly, Abby tugged at Takoda's hand without hesitation, her small fingers wrapping firmly around his. That single act of trust silenced them for a breath, long enough for Chenoa's heart to steady. They reached the tavern, where the light was dim and warm, and Elias Boone, its keeper, leaned on the counter with tired eyes. He watched as they entered, his gaze flicking over the unlikely trio before settling on Chenoa. You've stirred the nest, he muttered, though his tone was not unkind. They'll talk harder before they quiet. Chenoa only nodded, guiding Takoda to a table near the back. She poured coffee from a chipped pot, her hands steady now as she set the steaming cup before him. He wrapped his fingers around it, though his shoulders hunched inward, as though he wished to take up less space in the room that once would have feared to contain him. I bring you shame, he said finally, his voice low, the words roughened by years of silence. Chenoa looked at him, and the quiet weight of her gaze was more eloquent than any sermon. You bring me truth, she replied, her voice soft but unwavering. From across the tavern, Hattie Crowder's laugh sliced through the air like a whip. She sat with two other women, their bonnets dusted with frost, their eyes sharp as needles. Truth, she repeated, loud enough for all to hear. The only truth is she's throwing herself away. A woman her age ought to be looking for a husband who'll give her children, not an old relic who can barely stand against the wind. Takoda's hand tightened around the cup. He did not look up, though every muscle in his body urged him to. His pride was a wounded animal, pacing inside a cage of bone. But Chenoa rose from her seat with the grace of someone who had borne ridicule before, and was no longer afraid of it. She walked to Hattie's table, her steps measured, her breath steady. What I choose is mine, she said. You may not understand it, and you may not want to. But you will not speak of him as though he were less than a man. He has stood longer than storms, longer than your laughter will ever last. The tavern grew silent, all eyes drawn to the confrontation. Hattie opened her mouth, but no words came. Chenoa turned and walked back to her table, the fire in her step unbroken. For the first time in many years, Dakota felt the flicker of something he thought extinguished. The sting of pride not in himself, but in another who saw him clearly. He lowered his gaze, ashamed of the wetness in his eyes, though the coffee's steam gave him cover. Later, as night deepened and the snow thickened outside, Chenoa lit a lamp in her small cabin at the edge of town. Dakota sat near the hearth, the flames painting his white hair in shades of gold. Abby curled against his leg, her small voice weaving tales of the parents she had lost, the home that had crumbled too soon. He listened without interruption, each word soaking into the cracks of his silence. When she finished, she looked up at him with eyes that expected nothing, and yet received everything in his quiet presence. She reached for his large hand, pressing her cheek against it. He did not know how to move at first, but slowly he rested his other hand on her hair, the gesture clumsy yet filled with a tenderness he had forgotten he could hold. Chenoa watched from the chair by the window, her sewing idle in her lap. She saw the shift. The giant with white hair, once bowed beneath judgment, now steady in the simple grace of a child's trust. And her heart ached with the beauty of it, with the promise that perhaps love could grow from the soil of shame if watered by patience. But even as warmth spread within the walls of the cabin, outside the storm of rejection swelled. Marshal Enoch Vale came the next morning, his boots heavy on the porch, his voice colder than the snow. "You think the town will let this pass?" he asked Chenoa, his eyes flicking to Dakota with suspicion. "You're young, you've got a chance to make a life here. Don't throw it into the fire." Chenoa held her ground, though fear coiled in her chest. "This is my life to make." Vale's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing more, only tipped his hat stiffly and left, his tracks swallowed quickly by snow. Yet the warning lingered, heavy as smoke in the rafters. That night, Dakota sat long by the fire, his silence deeper than usual. When at last he spoke, his words carried the weariness of a man who had already lived several lives. "I should go," he murmured. "Leave before they harm you for what you've done." Chenoa's breath caught, but she did not cry out. She rose, crossing the small room, and stood before him. Her hand trembled as she reached for his face, tracing the lines of age, the streaks of white. "If they cannot see you, let them be blind." "I will not." Her words struck harder than any blow he had known. He closed his eyes, ashamed of how much he needed them. Outside, the storm howled, battering the walls, shaking the shutters. It seemed to echo the conflict within him, the pull between staying and leaving, between shame and the fragile beginning of belonging. As the wind screamed across the land, Abby stirred in her sleep, whispering something only children whisper, unafraid of dreams. Dakota looked down at her, then up at Chenoa. His lips parted, and the words trembled at the edge of release. "I cannot," he began, but the storm rattled the door so fiercely it cut him short, leaving his vow unfinished, suspended like a question in the frozen air. The storm came down in earnest that night, a relentless white curtain that swallowed the town and pressed against the windows of Chenoa's small cabin. The walls creaked as the wind clawed at them, snow piling higher against the door, shutting them into a fragile world of wood and flame. Inside, the fire burned bright in the hearth, its glow flickering across Dakota's face, softening the sharp planes into something gentler, something almost human again after years of being carved into stone. Chenoa moved quietly through the room, her shawl slipping from one shoulder as she set bread on the table. The lamp's flame cast a halo of gold around her, and when Dakota looked up, it was as though he saw her not as the town saw her, a reckless young woman choosing ruin, but as she was, resilient, rooted, unafraid to stand in the shadow of his shame. He reached for the bread slowly, his large hands dwarfing the small loaf. "You risk too much," he said at last, his voice a gravelly murmur, the words reluctant as though torn from him. Chenoa sat across from him, her eyes steady, the firelight mirrored in their depths. "What do I risk, Dakota? Their gossip? I have lived beneath whispers all my life. They are lighter than snow once you stop trying to shake them off." Her calm cut through him more sharply than anger could have. He had expected resistance, perhaps even fear, but not this unwavering gentleness, a strength that did not need to roar. Abby curled on a rug near the fire, her small figure rising and falling with sleep. She had spoken for hours, telling tales of her parents, of the days before sickness claimed them, of dreams she still carried though she hardly understood them. Dakota had listened without interruption, nodding at the places where words faltered, offering silence that was heavy but kind. Now she slept with her head near his knee, as though his presence was enough to hold the night at bay. Chenoa watched the scene with quiet wonder. "She trusts you," she said softly, almost to herself. Dakota's gaze shifted downward, resting on the child's fragile form. "She should not." "Why?" "Because I cannot promise I will stay. I cannot promise anything." Chenoa leaned forward, her elbows on the table, her voice steady though her heart pounded with fear of losing what she had just begun to find. "Then don't promise. Just be here. Just this moment. Isn't that enough?" For a time, neither spoke. The fire cracked, throwing sparks that leapt and died in the chimney's throat. The wind moaned outside, rattling the shutters, a wild creature hungry for weakness. Inside, silence stretched, but it was not empty. It brimmed with the weight of words unsaid, the fragile beginnings of something neither dared name. When Dakota finally raised his eyes, they held not defiance but vulnerability, raw and startling. "You see me," he whispered. "And it frightens me." Chenoa's throat tightened, for she knew he had spoken the truth not only of himself but of her. She saw him not as the town saw him, not as the tribe had abandoned him, but as a man weathered by time and loss, still standing. And in seeing him, she risked being seen herself, her loneliness, her yearning, her refusal to live half a life in silence. A sudden knock rattled the door, sharp against the roar of the storm. Abby stirred, murmuring in her sleep. Chenoa rose quickly, glancing to Dakota, whose hand instinctively brushed the knife at his belt though he did not draw it. When she opened the door, wind and snow rushed in, nearly extinguishing the lamp. On the threshold stood two men from town, their hats crusted with frost, their eyes bright with malice. "We came to warn you," one sneered. "You think you can play house with him, but folks won't stand for it. You're young, pretty. You don't belong wasting yourself on a white-haired savage." Chenoa stiffened, the cold biting her cheeks. Before she could speak, Dakota rose. His height filled the room, his shadow thrown huge against the walls. He did not lift a hand, but his presence alone shifted the air, heavy with restrained force. "Go," he said, his voice low but steady, carrying the weight of a man who had fought storms fiercer than this. For a moment, the men faltered, then spat curses into the snow and turned back into the blizzard. Chenoa shut the door, barring it against the cold, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the strength it had taken to stand still. When she turned, Dakota was watching her, his face unreadable. "You see what comes with me," he said. "I see," she answered, meeting his gaze. "And I still choose." Something in him broke then, not into weakness, but into release. He sank back onto the chair, his hands covering his face, his shoulders shaking though no tears fell. Chenoa crossed the room, knelt beside him, and gently pulled his hands away. His eyes burned with shame and longing, but beneath it all flickered a faint light he had thought long extinguished. Her fingers brushed his cheek, warm against the roughness of his skin. "You are not too old for love," she whispered. "You are not too late." The words settled into him, deeper than bone. He could not answer, but his silence was no longer defense, it was surrender. They sat together before the fire, the storm howling outside, the warmth within their fragile shelter growing stronger by the hour. Abby, still dreaming on the rug, stirred and reached out her small hand. Without thinking, Dakota clasped it, the gesture natural, unforced, binding. Chenoa saw it, and for the first time in years, she smiled not out of duty, but out of joy that rose unbidden, like spring beneath snow. Yet even as warmth filled the cabin, a shadow lingered at the edges of the firelight. The town's judgment had not been silenced, only delayed. The storm outside was not the only one they would have to face. Dakota stared into the flames, the glow painting his white hair in hues of copper and gold. His jaw tightened, and when he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with foreboding. They will not stop. The words hung in the room like smoke, curling upward, staining the ceiling. Chenoa's hand remained on his, but the flicker of fear in her eyes betrayed the truth she already knew. The fire snapped loudly, sending a spray of sparks into the dark. Abby murmured again, as if in answer to a question none had spoken. And in that moment, with snow pressing harder against the walls and whispers waiting beyond the storm, Dakota felt the fragile thread binding them draw taut, stretched to its limit, ready to either hold fast or snap. The blizzard raged for 3 days without pause, burying the town beneath a silence broken only by the groan of timbers and the cry of wind. Snow climbed high against Chenoa's cabin, muffling the world beyond, until it seemed they were sealed inside a coffin of white. Firewood dwindled, food thinned, and yet the greatest weight pressing upon them was not hunger, but the gaze of those unseen, the judgment that seeped through walls like smoke. Dakota rose each morning before dawn, shoulders hunched against the cold, hauling logs from the shed where drifts nearly swallowed the door. His hands, cracked and red, worked without complaint, though each motion bore the heaviness of a man who believed his labor could never balance the cost of his presence. Chenoa watched him from the window, heart aching at the way his strength bent under invisible chains. She longed to ease him, to remind him he was not alone, but words seemed fragile in the face of his silence. Abby, restless, carved shapes in the frost on the window panes, her small voice breaking the hush. "Why don't they like him?" she asked once, her tone not bitter but full of bewilderment. Chenoa knelt beside her, smoothing a strand of hair from the child's face. "Because they do not see what you see." Abby considered this, then turned back to her drawings, as though the explanation was enough, even if it solved nothing. On the second night, a pounding came at the door, loud as thunder. Chenoa startled. Abby clutched at her skirts, and Dakota's hand went to the knife at his belt. When the door swung open, Marshal Enoch Vale stepped inside, his coat powdered with snow, his expression hard as stone. He shook the storm from his hat, then fixed his gaze on Chenoa. "You can't keep this up," he said, his voice heavy with authority. "You're stirring the town into unrest. People are afraid, and fear turns ugly when it has nowhere to go. Send him away before they decide to take matters into their own hands." Chenoa straightened, though fear coiled in her belly. "He has done nothing to them." Vale's eyes flicked to Dakota, lingering on his white hair, his massive frame. "He doesn't have to. His presence is enough." Dakota stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "I will leave." The words fell like stones, and Chenoa felt the air leave her lungs. "No," she said sharply, turning to him. "You will not." Vale's brow furrowed, but he did not argue further. He left with the storm, leaving behind the echo of his warning like a shadow stretching long across the firelit room. That night, Dakota sat apart, his back to the flames, staring at the dark window as though the snow concealed the voices of his accusers. Chenoa crossed the room, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, and knelt beside him. "Don't you see?" she whispered. "Every time they push, you step back. Every time they call you unworthy, you bow your head. But you are not what they say. You are more." His jaw tightened, but he did not answer. Instead, he rose and pulled on his coat, heading for the door. Chenoa caught his arm, the weight of his muscles solid beneath her grip. "Where will you go in this storm? To die so they can be proven right?" His gaze met hers then, dark and burning with conflict. "Better I die in the snow than bring ruin to your life." Her hand trembled, but she held fast. "You are my life," she said fiercely. "Do you not understand? I chose you, not their whispers, not their judgment. You." The words cracked something open inside him. His arm slackened, and he sank back into the chair with the heaviness of a man fighting an unseen war. The blizzard worsened on the third night. The cabin shook under the wind's assault, the fire hissed as snow forced its way through the chimney, and hunger gnawed at their bellies. Yet in that crucible of survival, something changed. Dakota worked with renewed resolve, sealing cracks with cloth, reinforcing the door with heavy planks. Chenoa fed the fire with every scrap of wood left, her hands blistered but steady. Together they labored, and when exhaustion threatened, Abby's soft prayers filled the silence, weaving courage into their weary bones. In the darkest hour before dawn, the fire nearly died. Chenoa knelt before it, blowing desperately at the embers, her face streaked with soot. Takota watched her, something breaking inside him at the sight of her fighting so fiercely for the life they shared. He moved beside her, cupping his massive hands around hers, shielding the flame from the draft. Their breaths mingled as they coaxed the fire back to life, a fragile glow swelling into warmth once more. When the blaze leapt high again, illuminating their faces, Takota turned to her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Why do you not let go?" he whispered, the question carrying years of disbelief. Chenoa leaned close, her lips near his ear, her voice trembling but sure. "Because I was born waiting for you. And I will not let the storm take what I have found." The words pierced deeper than any spear, carving through his shame, his fear, his doubt. For the first time in many years, Takota allowed himself to believe he was not a burden, not a ghost, but a man still worthy of being chosen. The storm began to ease by morning, the wind softening, the snow thinning to delicate flurries. Light filtered through the cracks in the shutters, pale and hesitant. They emerged from the cabin to find the world remade, a vast white silence stretching across the land, clean and unforgiving. Chenoa's hand found his, and though his instinct was to pull away, he let her hold him, the warmth of her grip anchoring him to the earth. Abby skipped ahead, laughing at the sight of snow piled higher than her head, her joy a balm against the scars of the night. But even as the storm relented, Takota knew the greater trial had only begun. The town would see their survival not as strength but as defiance, and defiance was fuel for wrath. He looked down at Chenoa, her cheeks flushed, her eyes shining with unbroken resolve. She had chosen him again and again, against every voice, every warning, every storm. And yet, as the church bell tolled faintly in the distance, echoing across the frozen town, he felt the weight of a truth pressing against his chest, heavy and inescapable. "They will come for us," he said softly, his voice carrying not fear but certainty. Chenoa met his gaze, her chin lifting, her grip on his hand unyielding. "Then let them come." The words hung between them, fierce and fragile, a vow and a challenge both. The snow around them gleamed with the first light of day, and in that brightness, the shadow of judgment stretched long, promising the battle yet to come. The storm had broken, but its silence lingered, heavy as stone. Snow lay deep across the town, smoothing rough edges, covering wagon ruts, muffling even the voices of those who gathered in the square. They came not in celebration but in curiosity, in judgment sharpened by cold. Whispers curled like smoke in the frozen air, eyes darted from one face to another, all seeking the spectacle. The young settler woman and the old Apache with white hair. Takota stood tall at the center, his frame still broad though wearied by years. The winter sun glinted off his hair, turning it silver against the dark of his buffalo hide coat. His jaw was set, but in his eyes flickered the same question that had haunted him for weeks. Was he worthy of standing beside her? Chenoa approached, her cloak brushed with frost, her cheeks flushed crimson by the bite of wind. She walked without hesitation, each step crunching against snow, her gaze fixed not on the crowd but on him. Her hands trembled only when she reached him, but when he offered his own, calloused, scarred, strong, they steadied. The marshal stood nearby, his hat pulled low, his expression unreadable. Enoch Vale was not a man to bend easily, yet even he had been moved by the sight of them enduring the storm together. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying through the hushed square. "If you are certain, Chenoa, I'll bind this union. But once done, it cannot be undone." Chenoa's chin lifted, her voice ringing clear. "I have never been more certain." The murmur that followed was sharp, a wave of disapproval that spread through the crowd. Hattie Crowder whispered loudly to the woman beside her, her words biting. "Foolish girl, wasting herself on a man who should be grandfather to her children, not their father." Takota's shoulders stiffened, but before shame could bend him, Chenoa's hand pressed into his. She turned, her voice strong, cutting through the cold. "I would rather bind myself to a man who has endured storms than to one who hides from them. His hair may be white, but his spirit is more alive than any I've known." A hush fell, for there was truth in her defiance, undeniable even to those who scorned her. Elias Boone, standing at the edge of the square, nodded faintly, his eyes soft with respect. Vale drew in a breath, then began the vows, his words plain but solemn, echoing in the brittle air. Takota, do you take this woman, to walk with her through winter and storm, to guard her life with your own? Takota's voice was low, deep, steady. I do. And you, Chenoa, do you take this man, to see him not as the world does but as he truly is, to walk beside him in shame or in honor? Chenoa's eyes glistened, but her answer came without pause. I do. The vows sealed, the marshal closed the book with a weighty thud, and for a breath the world seemed suspended. Snow drifted lazily from the sky, touched their hair, clung to their lashes. Chenoa lifted her face, and Takota, trembling, lowered his. Their lips met, soft at first, then certain, a union not forged by youth or expectation but by endurance, by the defiant choice to love against all odds. The crowd shifted, some turning away in disapproval, others silent in awe. Hattie Crowder's lips pressed thin, yet even she did not speak again. A change moved through the air, not victory, not defeat, but something deeper. Acceptance, reluctant perhaps, but real. Abby ran forward then, her laughter ringing like a bell, her small arms wrapping around their joined hands. We're a family now, she cried, her voice pure as the snow itself. The sight of her joy cracked open the hardness in Takota's chest, and for the first time in years, he let his heart expand without restraint. Chenoa leaned close, whispering so only he could hear. See? The storm could not take us. Nor will they. He looked at her, at the strength in her eyes, and felt the truth of it settle into his bones. She had waited her whole life for him, and now, astonishingly, he found he had been waiting for her too. The square slowly emptied, townsfolk dispersing into the white streets, their voices muted, their judgments softened by the spectacle of vows spoken without shame. Only the three of them remained in the quiet, the snow falling like a blessing. Takota turned toward the horizon, where the land stretched vast and unbroken, blanketed in white. Once, he had thought his life narrowed to a path of endings, too old for battle, too forgotten for peace. But now, with Chenoa's hand in his and Abby's laughter at his side, the path stretched wide again, filled with promise. The fire that had nearly died in him burned steady now, not with the fury of youth, but with the enduring glow of something that could not be extinguished. He drew Chenoa close, his arm encircling her with a gentleness that belied his strength. You have given me back to myself, he whispered. And you, she replied, her lips brushing his ear, have given me the life I dreamed. The snow swirled around them, the world remade in white silence, and though storms would come again, they knew now they would face them together. Yet as the church bell tolled noon, carrying across the frozen town, Takota felt a faint stir of unease. For unions such as theirs did not pass without trial, and though vows had been spoken, the weight of judgment still lingered, waiting to test what had been bound. He held Chenoa's hand tighter, the strength in his grip speaking the words he did not say aloud. He would stand, no matter what came. The snow thickened once more, the wind rising, and in the hush of the square, their shadows merged into one, fragile, defiant, unbroken.